Clabberton. Welcome to Conversing.
It's really an honor today to have Ben McBride as our guest on Conversing. Ben is a visionary leader, and he's a visionary leader of what he calls radical belonging. This is at the very core of an enterprise that he and his wife are leading together called the Empower Initiative, which is a capacity building firm devoted to empowering organizations and communities in being able to foster belonging and to cultivate public safety. It is such a gift to have him. His work, his labor over years in Oakland has been transformative. And this recent book that we're going to be discussing is one that I just think you will not want to miss. Ben, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Mark, thanks for the invitation.
You know, I think we've known each other for approximately 20 years or so. And I have long admired you. And I was eager to have you on as a guest today because of a recent book that you've written that I'll say a bit about in just a minute. But even from the time that I first met you, I saw you as a person who was really an example of what you're actually writing about in this book, which is about radical belonging and also about being a bridge and being a bridge builder. And bridging is the verb. And I feel like that's just been a characteristic of your life, both things. And the journey that you tell in this book is a very candid and honest and helpful journey to understand how much more deeply you've needed to move into those two spaces. It's really clear in the book that you don't presume to have been what you don't believe you were in the past, but have gradually moved into being more fully. And I just that gives credibility to me as we come to our conversation today. So it just really means a lot that you're here. The title of this new book that you've written is called Troubling the Water, the Urgent Work of Radical Belonging. It's a short book, but it is a crisp, tight manuscript, and it is filled with both extremely helpful words of description and analysis combined with great candor, vulnerability on your part, Ben, the significance of the pain journey that you've been on and that others who are African Americans and many other people in our society are on. And it's a book of tangible hope, even while it's also a book of great strain. Like, this is a hard and deep work. So thank you for being on this journey, and thank you for what you've shared about it in this book. So when you began to distill in your mind that you needed to write this, just give us a little bit of the background, how that had come about. Say a bit more about your own upbringing and some of your earlier years and what brought you to this particular moment and this particular book.
Yeah, so much of my personal story, I think, serves as DNA for kind of the ways in which I'm walking out my day-to-day right now. Grew up in a family of 6 children and 2 parents whose my grandparents came from the South. My father was a survivor of Jim Crow segregation in the South. And we kind of grew up in these 2 worlds. One being during the day, we went to a conservative, fundamentalist, white Baptist Christian school in San Francisco. And then in the evenings, we went to an all-Black Pentecostal church in Berkeley. One believed in Trinitarian theology. The other believed in oneness theology. And the narratives that we were given was often that the other person was the bad person. They were the one that should be feared. They were the dangerous one. And yet I had to live in this dynamic of receiving academic influence and theological influence from one group and then getting cultural and theological influence for the other. So I think inside me just kind of got hardwired to this notion that the narrative of there's good and bad, it's a zero-sum game, I think got hardwired into me that actually was not true. And I think the further that I went on in life, I continued to find myself in places where that continued to teach me. And there was times I was more resistant to it. And there were times that I was more open to the idea that maybe there is something of value, something that I need in a community that I'm not either proximate to, or I don't really have the instinctive feeling that I can build community with these people or that I belong there. And so I think, fast forwarding it into the present, I think when I got into a moment, it's probably about 5 years or so ago, and I was really wrestling with, I think, the reality that we had real problems showing up in our society. I felt the realities of the 2020 summer coming, and I had played different roles in it from the time before the launch of the Black Lives Movement. There was actually a moment where I curated an event in Berkeley and had you and my brother talking, because I was having the sense then, that was 10 years ago.
Right.
I was having the sense then that something's getting ready to pop. And if we don't find a way to think about how we bridge these communities, it's going to pop. And it did pop. But I think 5 years later, I then hit the point of saying, from being on the front lines and a lot of the movement and the activism versus also local work and working alongside police, et cetera, what I learned was that there was some work that I needed to do. And I learned that maybe I needed to invite others into some work and try to figure out, it's one thing to say we need to bridge with people across difference. We need to imagine a circle of human concern that includes those that we see as the other. But how do you do that? And what I learned through my own life was it wasn't a strategy to be implemented. It was actually a journey of formation that one had to go on. And so as I'm on it, I'm still on it. But one of the things I realized in writing the book was I could reverse engineer some of my own formation and hopefully invite others, not so much to see me as the prototype, but to start asking themselves some really hard questions around who they want to become, who they want to be in the world, the legacy they want to leave, and how that might invite them into some different choices.
Yeah. When I was first becoming a Christian, it happened really just through reading the Bible and the New Testament in particular. And the thing that most struck me was that if I was a person who was going to become a follower of Jesus, that it meant changing my sociology. And that meant changing the way that I think about myself, any other person, period, and across all the lines of division, distinction, et cetera. Now, that's a journey totally and still absolutely still underway. But when I was reading your book, I kept thinking, this is that essential work. And the interesting stereotyping that goes on, for example, I'll just say it as a white cultured person, thinking about a Black cultured person such as yourself, then yourself having to go into a further reorientation of your sociology because you realized, even though you might have shared the skin color and a lot of the racial experiences perhaps of people that you were dealing with, there was also such a gap between being sort of a middle-class Black kid growing up in San Francisco than people that were living in the kill zone in Oakland. And that journey, I just found both breathtaking and not told in as accessible a way as you make it possible to understand. Just say a bit more about that. I mean, describe a little more of your sociology growing up, but then what that process really involved as you face this small zone within Oakland, which is the most violent and where the highest number of homicides occurs and so forth. Just describe that. You do it so well in the book.
Yeah, well, I think the privilege that I had growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in San Francisco, particularly because my dad got drafted into the Vietnam War and was able to buy a house for $24,000 in San Francisco. Oh, those were the days. But, we kind of had this experience. I joke sometimes, we were like the Christian version of the Huxtables without all the Bill Cosby drama, right? But we were kind of had this really safe kind of nuclear family. And yet when I moved into the kill zone, the reality that I sat with was, although there were people that looked like me in terms of racial identity, skin color, we shared some of the same cultural practices. I also realized that I had been making assumptions about them, assumptions around why their communities were in the state of disrepair that they were, the things that they needed to do in order to make change, the things that they wanted, a whole lot of different dynamics. I came into that community with a whole lot of assumptions. And, I joke sometimes because I say, my little messianic complex that just comes from some of my fundamentalist Christian upbringing that, I've got the solutions and I'm going to come in and this is really math that we're talking about. If you do this and you do that, then you get this.
Right.
And I came in to kind of save the Killzone of East Oakland. I think it ended up saving me. It saved me from a consciousness where I needed to be in control in order to be in community, that I needed to have all the right answers. And what's so interesting is people will label these things like, these are the patterns of white supremacy, et cetera, and all these different jargons. And yet I was a black person as you're going to experience. And yet I was dealing real time as a human being with, although we look alike and we share lots of things in common, we're very different. And that actually created opportunity for me to learn. But I think the biggest awareness is for me, like the Killzone of East Oakland was really like this community of about 30 by 20 blocks within a city of 400,000 people, where, you had someone dying every other day and being shot every day. And so what I learned over the course of what was supposed to be a 5-year journey that turned into a 12-year experience was that there were beautiful people in the middle of this pain, that the opportunity was really for me to be a learner and a co-creator with them, that I had to go on my own journey to even know what it meant to be in relationship with them, that I had to be willing to be a novice. So much to me about living in the kill zone was transformative for me, particularly because I had to learn what it felt like to live in poverty and struggle with the realities of, not only was I making assumptions about them when I moved in, but once I moved in, people were making assumptions about me. And just the reality of all of that, it still for me serves as my greatest teacher, my greatest lesson, because what I walked away from that so tangibly is that nobody is one thing.
Yeah.
Nobody is one thing.
Ben, one of the stories that I found particularly moving was the story that you tell about a guy who was sitting on your front steps one day and how that unfolded. Can you retell that story?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real powerful moment to me that provides the invitation. I'd come and I was engaged with doing some work at the city team and doing work that Mark and I used to be proximate to. I was doing work around, some of the under-resourced people in the city of Oakland. Long story short, I come home and I'm getting ready to go in my house, and here's a brother that used to hang out on my doorsteps all the time. And so I'd kind of come up to him and I'm like, hey, man, can you move? My family's coming home. And he and I'd have this thing going back and forth. And, I joke sometimes because I'm like, not only was I, going back and forth with him, but then with Janelle, my wife, would come home, we'd have intense fellowships, what we call it in our family, about, can you get this guy off the stairs? Until one day I came home, he and I are in the banter, and I paused. And I saw a look in his face, and I asked him a question, Mark, that I hadn't asked him, which was, why are you sitting on my stairs? And then he proceeded to tell me, no disrespect, I used to live here. And he said, I recognize that you, your wife, you guys own this house now, but I used to live here. I grew up here, and my mother's passed on now. And so when you leave, I come and sit on these stairs because this is the closest I can get to my mom. And so I recognize that for you, this is disrespect. But for me, I'm just trying to be where I belong. And it still fascinates me. Again, it's not the beauty of it, but just this notion that I'm a Black guy showing up to another Black guy in a story without realizing that, I have in my mind that because I bought the home, it's mine, and that somehow erases the sacredness, the connection, the memory, like the reality that there was someone else here before. And that belonging meant that I couldn't just use a bank statement to say, your story's over and my story begins.
Yes.
But there was some work that we were going to have to do to figure out what it meant for us to hold this sacred space and all the memories together.
Yeah. I think to me, that story and a number of other ones, but that story in particular felt like it was a lens into what you then go on in the book to sort of help us understand through various categories and structures, sort of framings that you've created for being able to describe what's happening. So why don't you tell us about the 4 Ps, and then why don't you place this guy and yourself in that structure? And then what what needed to happen. So this is, I think, where the book really intersects with how it can change the way that we perceive things.
Yeah, I love this framework that actually came to be through trial and error and trying to find language to understand what was happening. I think about human interaction and society, our systems, and I say you normally can kind of organize us into four quadrants. One is the powerful, and these are the people who set the conditions for how things go or how a thing is. And then you have the privileged. Now, while the privileged don't necessarily set the conditions, they often benefit from the status quo, from the way it's been set up. Then you have the persecuted. And the persecuted are people who get some access into participating into this system or culture that we have, but for other reasons that aren't always obvious to them, they're restricted in some way. And then you have the prevented, who usually for no reason outside of who they are in the world, they're prevented from even participating with shaping the way this thing is going to function. And what I found is that, using the powerful, privileged, persecuted, prevented, it helps me understand that in every scenario, my proximity and station changes based on the scenario. So if we were to think about race in the US, well, I come from the prevented group, the descendants of Africa, who the country was not designed for us. And we were, othered in both cultural and structural ways. But then if I think about gender, then I move from the prevented into the privileged because I access the benefits of patriarchy and a male-dominated society. But then if I think about the organization I started, I move into the powerful because I'm the one that set the conditions for how things go. And if I locate that conversation with the brother who was on my stairs, well, in that scenario, I would say that I'm the privileged person because I'm benefiting from the powerful structure that's been set up about ownership of homes, having access to financial capital. And this brother is actually sitting in the prevented space because he's experiencing homelessness. He's struggling with addiction. He's formerly incarcerated, and he has a connection to a place that the system has said you have zero agency to have a connection to. And so what the quadrant helps me do is recognize that when I show up into a space, there's more work to do besides who's Black, who's white, who's Latino, who's Asian, who's Arab, who's gay, who's straight, who's Christian, who's not, et cetera. There's an opportunity for me to say, how is power showing up in this conversation? And where are there opportunities and invitations for me to move with deep empathy, understanding, curiosity, truth-telling? Like, yes. I need to slow down my judgment and my critique and assumption around what's happening and move it to a different place that I think can actually help us move forward.
I think it's a really beautiful tool. And I do think that I want to come to the question of how stereotyping and labeling figures into all of this. But what you've just given, I think, is part of why that story was so powerful, because it felt like suddenly it was not just that you were truly seeing him and understanding place in his life in a way that was even more important because of all the ways that he had been put into a circumstance of being the dejected. But you also were seeing yourself in a different way, because suddenly now the person that, quote, claims ownership, that is true, but it's not the whole story, which goes back to what you said a moment ago about the fact that none of us are one thing, and we are many things, and we are those things in a fluid way at times, and sometimes in a very, very stuck way in other times, depending, as you say, on context. If you were to take us into some of the places that you've been, where you and your brother Michael, who is a pastor in Berkeley, as you and others have been engaged in the kill zone, tell us a little bit more of how that story really unfolds, because you do understand as you arrive that you were a bit messianic in thinking, I'm going to move in and change the hood. But at the same time, immediately you realize that that's not really actually how this is going to work, and that you have to reinculturate yourselves, and that you have to get clear about what really is happening. And that's a very complicated thing for all kinds of reasons. Take us a little bit more on that journey. What had to be resorted in your own mind and heart as that unfolded?
Well, I mean, I think it was really a deep commitment to move away from activity and moving away from trying to do and moving towards formation, which is, why I really believe that the wrong first question is, what do we need to do? The right first question is, who do we need to become? Because if we become different and deeper versions of ourselves, it gives us access to the kind of doing we need to do, which sometimes is very different than what we would have done if we would have got on a journey of formation. And so, my journey into the Kill Zone actually started in a conversation with my brother Mike in the church that often, that sits right on University Avenue. It was our family church before Mike was the pastor. We grew up there. Talked about my neighbor in that house. We grew up at this little place on University Avenue that used to be a brothel and a club back in the days that was transformed into a sacred house. I'm going to talk about dueling stories.
Wow.
We had a Berkeley police officer who told us, a retired Berkeley police officer said, I used to drag people out of this house, and now I come in this house, and this is a house consecrated to saving souls. He's like, my mind is blown by this, right? We talk about the power of place, right? I'm sitting in that same building, and, I'm feeling as Pentecostal as I wanted to feel on a particular day. And I was telling Mike, about all the problems that were happening in Oakland. And I said, what we need is a revival, Mike. I said, we need a revival. We need people to get saved. That's what's happening in Oakland. And Mike said something to me that stayed with me. He said, you can't save nobody that's dead, Ben. You can't save nobody that's dead. And that was one of those moments. You talk about your sociology and your philosophy around things. I had to realize that I was putting in front of people I didn't even know what they needed, and not pausing to recognize that they need to be alive. There was other things that need to happen. So when we, began in our work to, confront gun violence and all of that, the more we went into the work, the more we recognized it actually was not about guns. It actually was not about the police. It actually was not just about public resources, although it was about lots of these things. But that really what it was about was the people who were either setting the conditions or benefiting from them, being willing to come into closer proximity to those who are experiencing persecution and prevention in the status quo. It was about the willingness to get in relationship with them. And for me, I had to learn, Mark, what it meant to be in relationship with somebody who rides around all day with a gun. I didn't know what it meant to be in relationship with someone like that. I didn't know what it meant to be in relationship with someone who is on probation and parole, and someone whose mother died in their arms when they were 7 years old, having overdosed from crack cocaine, and grew up through the horrors and the abuse of foster care system. I didn't know what it meant for me to be in a relationship with someone like that. And so the more that I got in relationship, the more that changed the way I showed up to the story. And then it was less about statistics or evidence-based strategies or whatever catchy jargon. And I think my brother and others would say the same. It became, what does it mean for me to be in deep relationship with this person and to contend for their thriving?
Right.
And it moves you, at least it moved me, into a deep place of humility.
Right.
And not having all the right answers all the time, and actually a place of weakness, a place of vulnerability. And, I think with some of I feel like over the last 15 years or so, I've had kind of the, Bruce Banner and Incredible Hulk, living at two different extremes, because you have these moments where you really want things to change. And so I'm out protesting in the streets and I'm angry, and then I have these moments where I'm like weak and heartbroken and I need help from people. I need help from God. Just what do I do? But what it taught me was that out of that more humble is the word that comes from me, vulnerable place. There was a gift for me personally. And I hope that we were able to participate in other people experiencing the gift of what could happen.
I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to conversing.
So let's go into that just a little bit more, because I think the journey is really critical. Everybody has their journey in that very regard, right? It's in a way, in a certain sense, you could just say it's the journey of learning to love, period. But that's way too antiseptic and distant from the granular reality of what it means to actually love at close range, which is where love actually is needed. So in that process, your emotions, as you say in the book, and I know from knowing you, you're a guy with, let's say, a full spectrum of emotional options.
That's a good phrase. I got to borrow that.
and many of them have been and are vividly a part of your life. So I know that. But along the way, it wasn't just the kind of surrender. It was also, I think, laying things down. Let's just start with anger. There's so much to be angry about. So much to be angry about. Honestly, completely justified anger and rage about the traditions, the histories, the systems, the bureaucracies, and the people that cause so many people to suffer, right? Those are things worth being really angry about. And there's a place even for the expression of that anger. But there's also a place where if that's the only emotional note you're able to play, then your ability to move closer to people is actually going to be more limited, but also your ability to do together, not just yourself, but together, things that could be transformative. So what is the journey of what psychologists call self-regulation emotionally for you? How do you, I'm not here trying in any way to suggest, Ben, that you or anyone on the front lines needs to somehow be domesticated. That's not why I'm asking this. I'm asking it more from just a human point of view, as you're trying to lean into this space, do effective action, admit the rage and injustice that exists, and somehow learn how to even cope with yourself, which is a big part of what the book is really about.
I really resonate with the notion that you're lifting about we've got lots of things in the world that make us really angry. There have been moments in my journey where I made some choices around how I will respond to being angry that upon more reflection, I wonder with curiosity whether I was just angry or whether I was also incredibly sad.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not know how to manage my sadness.
Yes.
I didn't know how to manage my hurt.
Yes.
I didn't know how to be in community with others with the pain that I was feeling, while also trying to manage some of my frameworks of masculinity and trying to be bulletproof in a world that I felt vulnerable in. And so sometimes anger would become for me the easy go-to. It's like the low thing on your emotional shelf when you open up the cabinet.
Right.
And so if you don't have the steps tool, you're like, well, I can get a can of anger. It'll do the job. It'll push people away. It'll give me a release from the consternation that I'm feeling. But I don't know if that's actually the emotion I'm feeling or the expression, but it's what's more easily acceptable. I think as I have been on the journey, one of the things that I realized was that grabbing that easily accessible can of anger all the time was beginning to erode my own sense of self and well-being.
Right.
And then that would create other problems where then that pain that I was feeling about that, I would project on others. I would need to grab more cans of anger, or I'd move over, get the can of judgment or the can of self-righteousness. Right. And now the meal that I'm making is not something that really is descriptive of what I feel or what I need, but I'm just kind of in this toxic flow, which, I found wasn't really helping me accomplish the goal I wanted to, which was I wanted people with power and privilege to pay attention to the challenges that were happening around us. But I also needed to find a way to do it in a way that didn't erode my own well-being. And so for me, the journey, what it had really been upon was finding a way to take care of myself while also contributing to the world becoming a better place, which also meant giving up some of the narratives that I had that it was all on me, or that I needed to solve the problems in my lifetime, or that every institution and organization had to be a pure expression of the thing that I wanted to see in the world, or even the idea that I somehow knew what a pure expression even would look like. There was work that I had to go on. And so I think anger, if not really investigated, and that's one of the things I try to invite people, I think in the chapter that I wrote around radical self-care, it's got to really investigate and explore what's happening for me. I mean, one more thing I would say too, that I think became dangerous for me, and I think others in the movement as I was involved in it, was something that I call manufactured rage. And I don't say a lot about it in the book, but, as human beings, we do a lot from social learning. And some of what I've become concerned about is when we begin to learn that, I am supposed to act angry. That is how I demonstrate that I care. Then we move into performative behavior that's actually not honest, and that also erodes our well-being. And so I've had to get a new relationship with myself, which has included therapy and new practices and a new relationship with social media. I mean, there was lots of shifts that I needed to make in order to figure out how to take care of myself. I had to get a new relationship with the movement and with people that would say, hey, Ben, we want you to come out here and shut the freeway down. I was like, that actually wouldn't be super honest for me to do. I'm not stopping you if that's what's honest for you, but it's actually not what's honest for me. And I'm not telling you to not do it. I'm just being able to name that honestly, it's not what I'm supposed to do. And I had to get comfortable how to say that and have a different story within myself that am I angry about, homophobia and racism and economic segregation and all these different things. Yes, I'm angry about it all, but that doesn't mean that I have to make behavioral choices that also are unhealthy for me.
Just for our listeners' sake, Ben does have a history of a capacity to shut down freeways, so it's worth noting that along the way. It's also, though, the case that I want to just say I learned from your anger. I was sometimes close enough to where you were to actually see it in person, but other times it was on social media. But I have to say, Ben, that I'm so grateful for the journey that you're on and what you've just described. I do want to say along the way, your anger really mattered to me. And because I trust you and because I respect you for who I believe you to be, your anger landed really differently to me than perhaps a person I just didn't even know, or that for some reason or another I was less trusting of, right? So I just think that's one of the complexities of this, right? It's not a purist.
And I would say, Mark, from listening to you, that it's whether it's anger or it's other emotions, what I'm also hearing what you say is it's real expression within the context of an authentic relationship.
Right.
And so if we get proximate to each other, then whether it's anger or it's joy or it's, these things matter to us when we're proximate enough to someone to say, actually, I'm invested in this person. Yes. I trust what they're going to communicate. And so if they're pissed off, then I actually do want to pause and reflect. But if they also are leaning in different ways, I also can benefit from that as well.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think one of the things about the book that is really interesting, to go to a different emotion that I think really does restrict a lot of the processes that you're encouraging people to take up, is the emotion of fear. And I'm working on a book about fear that I hope will one day see the light of day. It feels like it's an evergreen topic, so it's never going to land at a time when addressing issues of fear isn't going to be needed. But, you go through your own fear, and I wonder if you could just explain some of that again, because as a older white guy, some of the context that you needed to go into in the kill zone would be places that I, with full admission, would be fearful to go. And what was fascinating to hear was your description of you were afraid to go. And how did you come to learn how to manage, control, deploy, be smart about, be not paralyzed by? I mean, it's a very complicated journey, and you give us tremendous windows into that. So just sketch that a bit for people.
Yeah, I hope the book does create an opportunity for people to look underneath the hood a little bit versus seeing the courageous, kind of veneer on the front and kind of saying, hey, people that are taking really bold stances, they are as human as I am, and they're feeling some of these feelings. I remember the first night or two that we were in the kill zone, and I think I tell the story in the book where, Janelle goes out to the store to grab some things, and I hear, a gunshot battle in front of my house. And so I put the girls to bed, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I've made the wrong decision. I was already scared coming in. I'm trying to pretend to Janelle I'm not. I'm like, oh, this neighborhood's no problem. I'm fine. I am terrified, Mark. Like every time I hear a sound outside, I'm riddled. And then I hear a set of gunshots again. And now I'm like, oh my God, what have I done with my family? This is all happening within 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm literally just going up level and levels of adrenaline. And then there's this long gunfight in front of the battle. And by this time, I am praying on my knees. I'm like, I want to joke and say I was speaking in tongues. I'm sure I wasn't, but I was just like, oh Lord, I need some help. What have I done? And the bullets just kept going on and on and on until I realized like this can't be bullets, or else there's like World War III in front of my house.
Right.
I go open the door, and the Oakland A's had won a game. I was proximate to the Coliseum, and it's fireworks as they're celebrating a win. And there was this moment, and I said, wow. I said, when you are afraid, you can jump to very irrational places.
Yes.
Because you're afraid. Now, the thing that this happened for me over and over in more ways than I talked about in the book. I mean, walking the dog around the neighborhood and being afraid of the people that I'm in the neighborhood to connect with and be with and live in a community with, but I'm afraid of them. I'm looking at them. I'm questioning them in my mind. I mean, I would say through the 12 years, that fear went up at times. It went down at times. It never left, though. I think what I learned about my relationship to fear was that I did not have to be irrational in relationship to fear, that I could find a way to manage the reality that I was afraid, but also look for other choices to make in the face of that, which was to get curious or at times to take a break and say, I actually need to remove myself so that I can reset because I'm a little bit over my skis.
Right.
I've got so much fear going on inside me that I actually can't be present.
Yes.
I wish I could, but I just can't right now.
Right.
There was moments where I had to run out of my house and put pressure on somebody's wound who's bleeding out, in front of the house. And I'm terrified and afraid in this moment. And Janelle screaming to me, get back inside. What if they come back around and shoot you up? I'm scared. And yet in that moment, what I felt was this guy needs help. I'm afraid, but I'm also afraid that he's going to die if I don't help him. And so there was moments where I had to remove myself. There was moments where I could take courage in the face of fear. But what I realized was that I don't have to have a one size response to fear. It doesn't have to be a sum zero game that if I'm afraid, then I just totally run away.
Right.
I try to pause and ask myself, what can I do in this moment? Can I show up and be available? Is this an opportunity for me to find some courage? Or is this also a moment for me to be brave in terms of taking care of myself so that I can participate at another day? I didn't have a manual for this, though, when I started down the journey. So there's a lot of trial and error.
It's an amazing story. So take us to that moment. Your hand is trying to keep this guy from bleeding out. Lots of circumstances. The natural thing to do would be to call the police. Mm-hmm. This is loaded at this moment, literally loaded in any possible way that you might want to define that word. So what happened in that case? Would you call an ambulance? Did you call for the police? What happened out in that story?
Yeah, so I get out there. I'm like putting pressure on this guy's wound. So now I'm getting blood on my hands. A lot of things running through my brain, right? Is there anything in the blood of this man? Are my hands? There's lots of things that are real that are going on in my brain. And then so I run in the house. I grab a set of towels from the house. I run outside and Janelle's like, what are you doing? I say, I'm getting the towels. She's like, don't grab the good towels. So because she's also like anxiety. Right. What do we do?
Totally.
This is like a bizarre situation. I run out, I'm putting pressure on this guy wound. He's screaming to me, can you get me my phone? I'm like, dude, you're bleeding. Why are you worried about your phone? But he's worried about something else, and I still don't know what he's worried about. And so I tell Janelle, call the police. He tells me, don't call the police. So now I'm in this moment where I don't call the police because the person I'm trying to help is telling me don't call the police. So I don't know what that means. Yes, I don't know if that means something else is going to happen. It was a terrifying ordeal.
Wow.
At a certain point, the police still come because someone else had called the police from the gunshots that were there. But by the time the police came, this was a part of our neighborhood. He was able to reach his phone. Someone else pulled up, hauls him into the car, and I never see him again.
Wow.
The police show up. They're knocking on our doors. They're asking us, did we see anything? And my answer in that moment, Mark, is no. I didn't see anything. Because in that moment, I don't know that I'm safe to tell them.
Right.
I don't know what that means for him. But honestly, Mark, I don't know what that means for me.
Yes.
Do I put my family in danger by telling the police what happened? Do they put me in a situation where somehow I'm now in conflict with the man I was trying to help? Does he try to come back and harm my family? I mean, you want to talk about complication. And so when sometimes people will say, well, why won't people that are living in urban communities just talk to the police? I'm like, because your hands haven't been in the blood of someone's wound and you understand the complication of this scenario.
Right.
It's not that easy, but that was something I never knew living in my middle-class neighborhood in San Francisco. And so having been touched by that, when I was sitting in spaces and, the more I got involved with trying to figure out how to, improve the relationship between police and community, I just recognized that everybody is entering the conversation from a very different place, and quick judgments, easy answers, hashtags, talking points, man, they really are not sufficient for the complexities that we have in our communities.
Then tell people about the way that what unfolds gradually over time is this understanding, as you had said so well earlier, about the relationships and about the way that relationships inside the kill zone emerged and how those things over time have dramatically changed the statistics of homicide in Oakland. We know that violence is still high in Oakland, but the fact that the homicide rates have dropped in such a significant way because of the kinds of efforts that you and Mike and other people have done, especially in the kill zone. Just give people a picture of how that unfolded and why you think it has had such impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the relationships that we forged really came out of us. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, we actually started studying what's worked in other cities. And we studied that there was a group of pastors in the city of Boston who years ago found themselves in similar situations. And what they talked about was we had to get outside at night. We had to walk the communities at night. And we had to build relationships with the people with whom the story was othering, the people who were involved in gun violence. And so we did the same thing. We walked neighborhoods. I led a couple night walks on the weekends, one from, 7 to 8:30 for those who, wanted to get their feet wet. And then some of us went out between the hours of 11 and 12:30, 1 a.m. And we walked some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Oakland. We introduced ourselves to brothers and sisters that were hanging out. We carried a message that was primarily about, we love you. We want the shooting to go down, but we want to know what your needs are. How can we help you? And people were so surprised, like, you guys so you're out here to meet us. So like, yeah, we're out here to say that we care about you. We love you. What is it that we can do? We found that kind of engagement along with, us being willing to build new institutions and practices that close our proximity. So we created something called a call-in table. Now, this would happen 4 times a year where we would invite people who've been shooting at each other over the year to the table, along with police, along with a mother who's lost her child to gun violence, along with someone who used to be a gun violence offender but has now changed their life. The U.S. attorney would be there, the district attorney would be there, and we'd sit around and have a conversation where we'd say again, we love you. So imagine you got the police chief, you got myself, you got other colleagues sitting there saying, we love you. We want you to be alive. We want you to be free, but we need you to make a different choice. We'd bring employers there, say, if you want a job, we can hire you tonight. We're here to be community for you. And then we dismiss the police and it would just be community there. And we'd ask them, so how was that experience? What can we do to be in relationship? And what I found over and over, and the data showed it, that when we had this conversation with them, Mark, we created the space for them to be, 70 to 80% of them opted out of the violence by nature of a relationship with some power offered to them for them to become a better human being. And I remember one conversation I was having with a brother, and we were filling out this thing. I said, when's the last time you filled out for a job? He was 28 years old. He said, I only filled out a job application when I was 18, 19. I said, you willing to make a change, man? And he was like, I want to. I said, let me ask you. I said, why haven't you put the guns down this far? And he said, nobody has ever asked me and committed to actually help me put it down. And so what I just realized more and more was, we had to do those kinds of relationships, but that also meant we had to build relationships with the police department. And I had to go in, others did as well, and spend time helping the police to understand why there was mistrust for them in the community, and that we were committed to them being alive in the same way that we were committed to the young people in the community being alive. It was all of these relationships going back and forth, intertwining, traveling together, eating meals together, arguing at the table, agreeing at the table. But after, we were able to establish that in 5 years, we reduced the level of gun homicides by 50%. And at the same time, we reduced shootings. We also reduced police killings, had been every 6 weeks for 20 years. We went 4 out of 5 years with no police killings. We reduced injuries against officers, as well as uses of force, complaints against officers. And we did all of it without hiring more police. We literally took the people that were there and got them in deeper relationship with one another. I think the challenge has been, how do we keep those tables present? How do we resource them? How do we take care of the people to be at those tables? But what it inspired me, people ask me, how did I come to the work of belonging and bridging? And I tell them this story, Mark. I say it was sitting in between somebody who was shooting at people in the community and the police officer who was tasked to arrest that person. It was being in relationship with both of them at the same time to save both of their lives as well as mine that transformed me and taught me that principle can be applied in way more context than just a public safety context.
Ben, we could talk for hours because everything you've said in the book and everything you've said just now is worthy of so much more understanding and cultivation to really grasp the full picture of what you're giving us. But I have to say that story of what has happened in the kill zone is the story of radical belonging and its power. It is the story of how vulnerable human beings, for all kinds of layered reasons of complexity, have a very hard time doing well by themselves and by the people that are around us. And that only gets harder when we're caught in these structures of the powerful, the privileged, the persecuted, and the prevented. And what you've given us is today in this conversation is a great gift, but I strongly want to encourage people to get your book and to read it, to discuss it with groups, to think about your own perceptions, but as the book also says, to think about your own formation and your own action out of formation as opposed to just out of reaction. Ben, I've said before just how much I respect you. I love you. I'm so thankful for you and for the work that you're doing, and was honored to have you today as this guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they're released. And please, leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.